Okay, hello everyone. Today is June 28th, 2021. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup of SIG Network. This is a CNCF certified meeting, so please be nice to everyone and let's have a productive day. So going ahead and getting started with the agenda. No new issues to triage. I did highlight a PR involving, well, I didn't put it here, but I assigned Jay a PR involving some network policy tests that were resulting in some flakes that we were seeing in OpenShift downstream. And I had that link up, but now I lost it. So I'll find it again and add it back to here, but it doesn't really have to do with anyone in this meeting because we haven't been working on the netpol tests very much lately. Otherwise, the agenda is pretty open. As Yang and a couple of us were discussing earlier, we had a big discussion in upstream SIG network last Thursday regarding IP block recommendations, and that is concerning CMP. So I think it'd be good to do that, continue that here. You know, and I think it's going to be good just to keep talking about CMP in this group because, again, we brought up some things to SIG network and didn't get any absolutes. So yeah, that's kind of where we are with CMP, I think. Am I missing anything?
Yeah, I think that's true. Also, if you wanted any discussion of the document from the network policy V2 thing.
Yeah, I have that later on in the agenda as well. But I thought for now let's start with CMP.
Yeah, I was actually going to put some thoughts. I have put just the one slide together. If you like, I can share. But I was really going to kind of add some more material for the Thursday call, but we can kind of discuss that today as well.
Yeah, I don't think that'd be a bad idea. And just for filling in the group, Sanjeev and I had an out-of-band meeting with Dan Winship and Dan Williams, kind of like about this and about how to come away with, or like how to move this forward at large. So I assume that's what this slide is about, right, Sanjeev?
Yes, that's right. So I just want to kind of just share a couple of points, but we can spend a little bit of time on it today, but it was meant for the next meeting. But just to introduce the concept so that people can think about it maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine with that if you want to share.
Okay, just the one slide, just a couple of notes. Let me share. I think, yeah, you have to give me permission.
Just did.
Okay, do you guys see this?
Yep.
Okay, so as Andrew was saying, we were having some internal discussions within Red Hat about this, and part of this we've sort of had bits and pieces of discussion within this group and SIG network as well. And here are some thoughts, right? So if we look at the streams of work for cluster/admin network policies, maybe it would be better to look at these as multiple streams of work, right? So this is a potential draft proposal, but we haven't fully documented it. So for now, I just mentioned this. And the proposal is to consider looking at each stream of work independently, possibly via separate KEPs as well. And one way to break that down could be this. Now we're talking specifically about cluster/admin network policies here. This may or may not overlap with netpol v2. Okay, and that's for us to sort out what overlaps with what. So the thought is that the current KEP, the cluster network policy, because all this debate around IP block and what happens with NATing and host networks, maybe limit its focus just to intra-cluster network policy for cluster admins. Okay, do not focus on north-south cluster protection. Okay, so keep it limited to intra-cluster policy, and that also allows us to simplify the proposal in terms of oops, in terms of completely removing things like IP blocks, because IP blocks is primarily for north-south. So if we, and Abhishek and Yang and Andrew and everybody else, we can obviously work on this more. Um, we haven't filled out all the details here, but the point here is that we seem to be clubbing a few different semi-related activities. And this is also confusing some of the use cases, because in the use cases, we've got ingress control, egress control, we've got tenancy, we've got zero trust cluster posture, and we haven't got that much detailed feedback on the use cases as well. And maybe there's a little bit of confusion about use cases in the KEP as well as use cases in the API. And now we've added the use cases for the netball v2. So maybe to break it down into smaller chunks, and also which are more logical, because then we will have less debate around things like IP block. So the proposal is, one of the proposals is to keep the cluster network policy focused on intra-cluster network policy, again, targeted for cluster admins, and then have something, for now, I'm just calling it cluster external network policies, which potentially could be a new CAP or could be more than one new CAP, and focus this on cluster external network protection, which is essentially north-south or ingress-egress protection. I was actually literally writing this before this call, so I haven't even finished this slide yet. But basically, this would consider two kinds of things. One is ingress north-south protection, where it may have a component that somehow is related to the Kubernetes ingress as well, because you want to have a policy that works with ingress or not, right? I think you can have both the options. And then on the egress side, it does something like many of the CNIs have an egress control or egress firewall. It would sort of deal with that. So then those would also be they are admin network policies, but we do not need to confuse those use cases with the cluster network policy. And then those may need some variation of IP block or not, but we can remove the IP block from CNP. And so CNP can move forward as intra-cluster network policy for admins, and then cluster external network policies would address ingress egress.
Yep. So, I mean, the main problem, right, is CNP is not moving forward. So we took a step back and said, how do we fix this? We asked Dan Williams and Dan Winship this time. And, their viewpoint after we talked about it for a long time was like, originally network policy was made just for intra-cluster traffic, right? It was allowing, denying intra-cluster traffic. Later on, they added IP block to allow for ingress, egress traffic, policies. But with CMP, the problem space seems pretty wide and a lot wider. And it's almost like it's hard to create a one object solution to adequately handle both scenarios. So I don't know what everyone else thinks, but I mean, I'm not sold fully on it yet, but I think we should think about it.
So there's several axles you can split, right? I mean, here we've done intra and a sort of external. You can also talk about inter that can be expressed. You could also look sort of at, call it traditional, which is based on addresses, and then I wouldn't say modern, but I mean this that is more sort of label-based load balance network policies, and they don't make a good fit always. I mean, I've been playing around with, okay, how do I map IP blocks into labels as well? But so to be able to use these strengths in expressing based on, I mean, the manifest and the labels, right? And then we've seen examples for how that can be extended with tags to work. Even sort of intercluster has a big strength, because those rules are always what I call locationlessness. You can transport them fairly simple. Okay, well, you might have to map the namespaces, but you're sort of not dependent on anything about from the local installation they run on, right? You don't have to care about what addresses have been set and what they're talking to the outside and so on. So from that perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense to as much as possible separate these two things, and sort of that try to really to push on using labels and sort of what's built into sort of the definitions of pod services and whatever we come up with, right? And base the firewalling as much as possible on that and have a clear separation. So I don't think there's a good match between them right now. We end up with weird ways to describe an IP blocks that sort of does not follow the normal way of doing it in firewalls. So from that perspective, I think this could make perfect sense. The question then is, how do we take the IP block out of the normal network policy?
That would be a problem for NetPol v2.
Yeah, so that's where NetPol v2 would try to address those kind of improvements to NetPol v1.
So at least I find the interesting sort of to walk down that way and sort of see what can be, how it sort of can be done and used.
Another thing is that, so yeah, one other quickly point I'll mention is that the implementation of external network policies seems to be, there is not yet a consensus, right? Some people talking about having an external sort of gateway, right? Through which you have to go through, and then that does sort of these natting operations and all that. Some people are talking about a distributed solution. So I think we need to have a deeper dive into this external controls.
And most firewalls are zone-based, right? You don't want to have to end up writing too many detailed rules. You set up your rules for zones, and then you map things into the zones.
Yeah, let me finish. So basically the point is that this allows us, so we agree on the value of the CNP as it is based on labels, right? And this, once you take out the north-south thing, you take out the need for IP block as well. So it simplifies and we can say the use case is primarily cluster protection and some tenancy, and that's it, right? Intra-cluster protection.
I'm trying to understand what is the relation between intra versus the IP blocks.
Because IP block names the peer through explicit listing of IPs. So with most, if not all of the intra-cluster, you want to name them with labels, because if the source is a pod, the pod can come and go quickly. You don't really want to hard code the IPs. But external, you often do need to hard code the IPs because you're going to specific destinations, like going to www.russia.com, whatever, right? So that's where potentially FQDN based policies also come in, because FQDN also is largely on the north-south side, not so much on the east coast.
So basically your point is, if I understood correctly, since it is internal, you would be able to label them, why use IP blocks.
Yes, and that's even the history behind NetPol v1. I think Andrew, others who were involved in that, right? NetPol v1 added IP block primarily because they partially wanted to do north-south solutions, but it turned out to be kludgy, and then they had an IP block exception, which also causes problems with the data plane. So we want to help all these. Both have valid use cases, but if we decouple them, we'll be able to move the CNP forward. We will be able to remove the IP block. We will have a limited, smaller set of use cases, get agreement on those. They're basically intra-cluster policies targeted at the admin, and let it move forward. In parallel, we talk about north-south controls and really get into details of what the egress router should be, egress firewall. There's a lot of detail which has to be still analyzed there. And
got it.
That will probably have some component of IP block as well.
And with the blocks, you probably want to have some sort of, longest prefix setup, right? So you can make them simple and then allow deny and so on.
TBD, let's see.
Yeah. That's like, it can wait, right? But
yeah, but let's hear from Yang and Abhishek. I know y'all started this whole cap, right? This is your baby. So I don't know what you think here. Just analyzing ways to get it to move.
Yeah, one of the questions I have here is that, for the north-south, I know the north-south cluster protection sounds like an IP block thing, but I'm still wondering, like, what will be like an east-west case here? Like, does east-west being like an intra-cluster traffic, or should we consider multi-cluster use cases here as well, right? Because I know Abhishek has been sort of like working on some multi-cluster policy sorts. So I still see cluster network policy could just potentially solve those use cases, especially when we're looking at the tenancy models and we evolve the tenancy models to say that, hey, a tenant might be a couple of namespaces in the cluster instead of a single namespace in the cluster. Now, the multi-cluster scenario, if the multi-cluster scenario comes in, does that fall into label selectors, or was that used to be solved by the IP block? That if we remove IP block, it will not be solved anymore.
So in my view, multi-cluster has implications for all of these projects, whether it is NetPol V1, V2, or cluster network policy V1, V2.
Plus load balance in the services, right?
Right. So there, firstly, nothing that we are saying here or considering here prevents us from having a multi-cluster version of each of these network policies in the future, but we need to have the single cluster basically go to coding phase and accept it, right? If you see that the CNP kept, we actually currently don't have any multi-cluster in the current KEP proposal. And
right.
We are talking about simplifying it so that it would sort of, we talked about lots of things which we could do in the future. So multi-cluster is another thing which we could do in the future, both for cluster network policies as well as for NetPol V1/V2 as future API versions of that same resource. So I think we will slow down tremendously if we kind of add some multi-cluster use cases, but without having a multi-cluster architecture. With a multi-cluster architecture, you have to first decide where are those policies living which apply to more than one cluster, right? Is there a central command and control cluster, and then that distributes the policies to the others? Or is it some kind of OSS that is sitting outside of the clusters that is giving it to all the clusters? So without having that kind of model, we will spend a lot of time on the multi-cluster policy. So what we're saying is that, yes, we can do multi-cluster for all of these things, but it's not necessary perhaps for this KEP right now to add multi-cluster in order to make it work. And also, I don't think what we would be talking about would involve IP block. Okay. And finally, the point is that just because we're removing IP block now doesn't mean that if there's another use case which absolutely cannot work without IP block, we can't add it, right? It's easy to start small and add more in the future, but once you've added it, you can't take it out, which is what NetPol V1 has discovered, that they added IP block with some sort of idea about north-south use cases, but there's still a lot of questions about IP block.
Well, they added IP block and weren't able to define it, its use case and its, implementation details for every CNI, which has led to issues.
Right. And then that confused the north-south discussion also because it doesn't work properly with, host network and a few other north-south load balancing cases. So simplifying doesn't mean we can't add it in the future, but this allows us to move it forward, saying that this is for intercluster policy and admin focused. And we will address the north-south case via external network policies. And then, we'll keep. Anyway, I've spoken a lot. Maybe Abhishek, you have any thoughts, or anybody else?
Yeah, I do have thoughts. So I think fundamentally I agree on this division, especially, a keen observer of the cluster network policy KEP work would have noticed that we haven't iterated over IP block since uploading the KEP for the first time. Mainly because the use cases there are slightly different as compared to the use cases for what we are calling as intra-cluster use cases, right? So yes, it's something that we always wanted to figure out, not just for cluster network policy, but also for network policy in general, because it's something that affects both the resources. So definitely, I would not be averse to removing IP block, and I would love to see proposals on the cluster external network policies, because I think those use cases are valid. But we need to define them correctly, and perhaps it can be done external or separately for both network policies and the future addition to cluster network policy, or however it is being introduced. So that's definitely something that I think on a broader scale the team does agree.
Yeah, and also if you remember, Abhishek, actually you had also suggested one time that, hey, somebody needs to make a proposal for the egress firewall, right? Because I would say that is probably the first most important sort of external network filter.
Yeah, I still am not convinced on whether the maneuvering of traffic or routing of traffic should be part of network policy APIs. But I definitely feel like the how to define external access to external traffic does definitely is part of the network policy API. So unless someone comes with a proposal for this and it makes more sense for the use cases, I guess it basically what I'm trying to say is that we need to see the proposal to figure out whether this really should live in network policy, or not network policy, but this subgroup, or it's something that is more outside of the scope of the sub project.
Right. And I think, the main thing here too is we were looking at how can we move this along? Like that's been the overarching question now for a couple of weeks. And I think there's a lot of agreement on the fact that we need, some sort of tenancy in Kubernetes clusters, and we don't have that. And this would allow us to fully focus a feature development of cluster network policy on supporting that feature, which is desired by almost everybody. So we could design, the object better for that use case, come out with a better object, and allow it to move along quicker because you have less use cases to squabble about.
So do you have an update on where that is going? The sort of tenant, or is it going to be namespace based again, or is it just yet another type of object that comes in?
Well, currently it's defined as a tenant can be a namespace or a number of namespaces.
Okay, yeah. So it's a group of namespaces and not an extra level like that's also has been suggested, right?
Yeah. So as it happens, I just happen to have a picture here, which we actually introduced into the use cases repo. This is the proposed tenancy model that we would target with the cluster network policy. And the details are in the use case. Please provide your review comments there. But it's fairly simple, right? There's Kubernetes control system type namespaces. There's some distribution specific namespaces, and there are tenant namespaces, and the tenants can be no more than one namespace. And mostly tenants are isolated from each other, except in some cases under admin control. Some tenants can talk to certain specific services and other tenants.
That's a label.
Yeah, a specific label in a specific cross tenant can be exposed because this particular tenant is opening a public service for other tenants, but otherwise tenants are isolated from each other. And then there is limited control in the system namespaces as well. So this is all intra-cluster. You see, there's no north-south here. This is all sort of intra-cluster isolation. So all of this can be targeted with policy that does not depend upon IP block.
Right, but the FQDN is the same, right? You don't see a tenant in the FQDN. It's still namespace pod.
That's a slightly tangential discussion, but normally the FQDNs we talk about are external FQDNs, like www.
No, I meant internal. I mean cluster namespace pod, and so. But I mean this is cool. Yeah.
Okay, so this is already in our use cases being targeted by the current KEP, right? So what we're saying is to limit it to these sorts of use cases, and maybe at least for now, we're not saying permanently, but at least for now, remove the ones which are related to north-south. They may come back, or they may come back in a different resource. And possibly, again, we want, I'm happy to volunteer to do something more on some of these egress firewall and sort of put some draft proposal there. And that's what we maybe we'll share in the next couple of meetings. But for now, these are just some thoughts to share that in order to move the cluster network policy along, maybe focus it on intra-cluster policy, take out the IP block, and then have a separate effort for external policies. But please think about it. Feel free to comment. We can chew on it for a few more days. Yeah, that's all I have for this one. It was a little premature. We were going to put some more slides, but for now, this is the only slide I have right now on this, in this thought.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. I know it was a last second sort of thing. But made sense to bring it up just so we can keep trucking along here and not get stalled out. Because I guess, I don't know if everyone was there, but the discussion on last Thursday kind of spiraled into nothing related to what we started wanting to discuss, I think. Right, Yang and Abhishek? It was kind of like we spiraled into a whole nother problem.
Yeah, I think I saw Cal sent out an email on the mailing list on his thoughts, and I think it's something that makes sense because there is a lot of ambiguity when it comes to how a CNI has implemented this particular use case, and I believe that on some sort of level, all CNIs have done a good job of explaining what they have done. At least for these for the cases where you want to preserve the original source IPs, they have explicitly either added a new field to preserve that and made the assumption that whatever you see as the source IP is what you will the traffic will be enforced on. I think in terms of that, I think a lot of CNIs are very similar in the implementation and enforcement of that. But that's something that is probably not what is intuitive for a user. So there are ambiguous things, and I think this discussion kind of makes sense. And we definitely need to have a good story or good definition of this external cluster and external traffic. And I'm hoping that we can tackle that for not just for cluster scope policies, but also for network policies.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's blossomed into this huge problem, not huge problem, but a thing that requires a lot of discussion. So, makes sense to kind of split up the work items so that you and Yang and the main workers of CMP don't have to, take one step forward, 5 steps back with every little change. So cool. And yeah, that Google Groups discussion that Abhishek was talking about, I posted the link in the agenda. That was also something we don't necessarily need to talk about here, but I just wanted the members of this group to read it and give it a look over and maybe post some thoughts there. I know I was skimming it before this meeting. And there were some interesting ideas proposed for sure. Okay, anything else with that? Awesome. Cool. So the only other thing I had on the agenda today was just a call to keep commenting on Prasad Nadim's document regarding V2. I saw Sanjeev was able to get some time to poke around there. Thanks for doing that. But otherwise, I think we're still just in the early stages. Do you have anything to say there, Prasad or Nadeem or Sanjeev? Do you want to talk about anything?
Yeah, I just saw the comments. I'm going to reply to Sanjeev's comments. Yeah, I think after this call, I will start responding to it. And I have one more question related to V2. So today, all our network policies are CNP, based on the default pod networking. But Kubernetes also introduced, NAD definitions to create virtual networks, parallel to pod networking. So would these policies apply there, or how does what's our thought process in that? That's another general question, like, it may not be for V1 or V2, in general for any network policy.
So as far as I know, even when the multi-network CRD was being developed, the assumption was that the network policies only apply to the primary interface of the pods and not to these additional interfaces that are attached to it. I do believe someone posted last week, or probably it was you, who posted a similar work that is being done. They are kind of trying to expand the scope of network policy to multiple interfaces by the means of annotation. So, but but to answer your question about how the current set of network policies affect these multiple interfaces, they should not be. They are only meant for primary interfaces.
I see.
There also, I think we should welcome some use cases which make that clear, because one logic could be that the multi-network use cases are primarily used for NFV. And in the NFV case, you have a very more controlled network. Do you need network policies like this? Or your policies, filtering policies will be implemented by the appliances themselves doing filtering? So use case clarity for the multi-network network policy would be good.
I see. Yeah, actually, worked on the OpenStack use cases where, you have multi networks. So basically you have multi networks, like, and that connectivity is done through, either like, LR, like, logical router or something like that. Then on top of that, like, you still apply the network policy likes things. So I was trying to map that construct here, because even in 5G use cases, what happens is, like, you might have, a red network or green network, but still, you wanted to have some services, following the network policy rules. So, if you want, I can, give little more crisp, use cases, why we need the network policies for the the other interfaces, non-primary interfaces also.
Yeah, please do. Please add a use case for why for the multi-network network policy.
Yeah, I will do that. And maybe should I capture that in the V2? I know, maybe put question marks there, then, everybody start commenting on that. Should I do that way, or what do you think, Sanjeev?
I'm okay with that. I mean, whatever everybody feels.
Okay, so let me just add it there. If it doesn't fit there, then we can remove, but at least, like, we have some place to capture,
Yes.
Yeah, so going back to Andrew's point.
Just a comment on the previous separation. I mean, you said multi-networking, it makes that also much simpler, right? When it's just labels, you have much less problems with multi-networking, because there's no networks mentioned. You just talk about instances that can reach each other, not how that is done. So yet another simplification to take out the IP blocks.
I see. Oh, you're mapping that to IP blocks. I see.
Yeah, if you have, so yes, absolutely.
Nice. Okay, got it. Yeah, so I will, please, all of us, if you can keep going to the V2 document and start commenting, I will respond. And I just saw a few comments from Sanjeev. After this meeting, I will go after them.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we'll keep iterating there. I also was starting to think about, obviously we have a pretty core group of people who have been coming to this meeting every week, but I think it would be great if we could foster, even more people to join. Because I mean, we have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of stuff that needs to be reviewed, and I know we're all pretty busy. I don't know if anyone has some good ideas for that.
So I have a young guy that's been doing, he's an intern really, but I mean, he's been doing, the whole time he's just been working on things around network policies. And that's what I will have him doing, what I call the semantics of network policies, and sort of how to break them down, how to represent just the labels, how they work with each other without having to keep track of all the addresses. So basically you do address to label, and then you compare labels. And I mean, he will go to school for years, so for long term, I think he could be a good guy to get involved. I'll invite him next week, because he's
Cool.
getting pretty interested in Kubernetes and networking policies, and sort of he should be out of school a year or two from now, and I plan to hire him then, but we can probably start pushing stuff on him before that.
Okay.
Before that.
Cool. Yeah, I think the more the merrier here. Especially the more that are willing to take on work items, right? So
Yeah.
sounds good to me. Cool. Well, that's all I had on the agenda today. Does anyone have anything else they want to talk about? Obviously, we have some more.
That's a question. Is
Yep.
there a meeting next Monday or not? I assume not.
Oh, it's the Monday after July 4th. I mean, if everyone's all right with canceling the meeting, I know Red Hat has a holiday that day, so.
I'm away as well, so yeah. I will try to call in if there is a meeting, but I just assume that everyone will in the US will not work, since it's the offset from the 4th.
Yeah, we have a holiday as well, so it's highly likely I'll not be present.
Okay. Yeah, I'll send out a note on either Friday or Monday morning about it, but plan on canceling the meeting for next Monday unless
Oh, yeah,
someone
just
else wants to pick it
Put
up.
it in the agenda, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One last thing regarding inviting other people, I would definitely want to see more practitioners. I want to see their real world experiences with the current network policy. That will help influence all of our future work. So if anybody knows any customers that are willing to drop in for one-off meeting or attend regularly and share real world experiences, I think that'll be really good. Another thing I would add is that anything that we're doing in the future, we need validation from all the CNI vendors, right? So for example, CNP, we need, the Cilium guys and the Calico guys and everybody to say, yeah, this makes sense. So at some point, we'll need to have a meeting with them as well. Maybe that's currently handled as part of the KIP. So 2 points are, one is more practitioners, of course, more people working on the code as well, but also that's the first one, more practitioners. Second one is, direct feedback from the different CNI vendors.
When you say practitioner, people operating clusters? Or
Operators,
yeah,
not
okay.
vendors.
Yeah.
Regarding the second point, we've done that in the past. So both Calico and Cilium and Entria have committed to absorbing the API in whatever is merged. So it's, if there are more CNI providers that you would want to get a yes from, we can invite them as well. So far I have spoken to Thomas and from Cilium and Casey from Calico, and of course we are here from Entria. So anyone else who you think we should invite?
Well, Andrew and I and others are from the Oven Kubernetes side. So yes.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm hoping that you both also agree to whatever is agreed upon as the CNP API.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's
so we have 4.
No, I was also referring to more around a little bit more details around, like, for example, let's say some CNI vendor says this is the most common use case we see for cluster network policy, and back it up with some specific data. Like, even the tenancy discussion, for example, we still had some debate about that. We still had some debate about the default network policy, sort of the best practices thing. So having somebody say, okay, from talking to Cilium customers, we find this is the most common use case for global network policy. And if there was something like a default, it would be useful this way, or no, they would have a different automation. So more around the vendors sharing what they've experienced with their CNIs, so that we could reflect that into this upstream efforts.
Yeah, I think that's why we continue to invite, we definitely, you guys are here from our Kubernetes perspective. And then we also continue to invite folks from Cilium and Calico to review the API specs, so that at the end of the day, when we approve or when people agree upon certain definition of the API, it is based on the reviews of all people from different CNI vendors. So I mean, beyond that, I don't know what else to do. I mean, is there a suggestion beyond
No, just more real world data? And no, we are here to address real world issues and incorporate them into the next versions of network policy, whether at the cluster level or at the netpol level. So any of this data, whether from practitioners or from vendors, it's useful. That's all. From operators or from vendors. But meanwhile, we continue doing what we're doing.
Cool.
Yeah, agree.
Awesome. Well,
Does anyone remember? I think there was Matt Fenwick who was working on the Cyclonus stuff, and has he, does anyone remember like if he stopped working on that, or he's finished doing his work, or?
I think it's still an active piece of work.
Okay.
I saw Jay bring it up the other day, talking about is there a way to, test conformance for various CNIs on network policy, and he brought up Cyclonus. I had pinged him a while ago about the possibility of getting Cyclonus incorporated into our new repo as a central like upstream hosting place, because right now I think it's just under Matt's personal repo. Do you have some thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think he is running some of those tests here for us in Antria. The thing that I wanted to look at was, eventually when we do CNP, we would also want to extend the tool or the framework to be able to, provide users a way to figure out how, the different policies in a cluster affect the traffic within the pods. Like for example, as a user, I want to check whether my pod 1 can communicate to pod 2. I want to know what network policies are enforced on that and what cluster network policies are enforced on it, and whether this communication is allowed or not. So this will kind of help users in a way to figure out whether the policies that they have written are enforced in the way that they expect it should be, and also kind of like a good way of.
The guy I spoke about is using part of the Cyclonus to build, among other things, that you should be able to ask both with addresses, but also pointing to specs or labels. Can this talk to this? Why or why not? Definitely.
Yeah, that's actually similar to what. Yeah, correct. I think that's what would be very helpful for users. So that'd be helpful for us.
Yeah, I can ask Matt for our next meeting to come by, give us an update, and we can chat about it some more if that works.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Abhishek, one more thing. I added a slightly detailed comment on your KEP going back to the priority ordering based solution, and I listed like 4 or 5 benefits, which I believe. So let me know if firstly that makes sense, or if you have any comments. But if you want me to move that comment back to the point in the document where you're discussing the priority ordering. But I don't know if you've seen it, but I feel like we should strongly consider the priority ordering, and I give several reasons for that. But you can respond to it.
Yeah, thanks. I did look at it over the weekend, but I have not yet responded to it. We'll definitely do that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. Keep up the good work. I hope you have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, guys. Bye.